On the 4th of December 1914, Aitken was relieved of command and replaced by Brigadier General Richard Wapshare for his incompetence. British forces adopted a defensive strategy after the humiliation at Tanga, with German attacks on British East Africa becoming a possibility. However, Tighe was uninterested in restricting his activities to British territory and launched an incursion into German East Africa, capturing the village of Yassen. Meanwhile, with the Königsberg safely tucked into the refugee delta, its crew enjoyed alcohol, cigarettes, and presents to celebrate Christmas. As a morbid joke, the British invited the German crew to try their Christmas pudding, which were given sizes referring to the heaviest guns in their squadron. The notes were floated up to the Königsberg on coffin-shaped bits of wood. Later, the enemies wished each other a happy new year. British forces also captured Mafia Island to keep watch on the Königsberg. On the 18th of January 1915, Lettow-Vorbeck attacked Yassen with 9 companies. Unreliable troops foiled the German surprise attack, firing prematurely and fled, only to be shot down by their comrades behind them. The day ended in stalemate, but the British garrison surrendered on the following morning, due to running out of ammunition. Lettow-Vorbeck's victory came at a high cost, with 300 total casualties, including 6 officers and 18 NCOs. This convinced him to switch tactics to guerrilla warfare, which was necessary to preserve such a small army. The British were also changing tactics for the time being, with Lord Kitchener giving directive for no more offensive action to be taken against German East Africa after this second British defeat. Lettow-Vorbeck's aim was now to economise our force in order to last a long war, so guerrilla warfare was evidently imperative. It was at this time that he received mournful news from home of his brother's death on the Western Front. This personal loss must have reinforced the importance of pinning down British resources and manpower in East Africa in order to aid the fatherland's war effort in Europe. Losses in the early battles needed replacing, which meant Lettow-Vorbeck was willing to recruit Europeans into askari units and native Africans into the Schützenkompanien. This breakdown in the racial segregation of German forces was epitomised by the introduction of black NCOs in command of white troops. The Royal Navy's blockade of German East Africa resulted in shortages of boots, uniforms, and vital medicinal quinine. At this stage in the campaign, Lettow-Vorbeck recognised the 700-mile Uganda Railway as a vulnerable target. German forces blew up tracks using dynamite with pressure fuses, so a total of 32 trains were also disabled as they drove over them. Additionally, 9 bridges were destroyed from March to May 1915. Small units of askari and European sharpshooters with native carriers lived off the land as they engaged in raids and bushfighting against British patrols. Armaments and horses were seized by German forces to sustain their activities. The British successfully deterred the enemy from using waterholes to drink from by putting up signs proclaiming these had been poisoned, though such an action was forbidden by the accepted rules of war. A plethora of tropical diseases such as malaria and yellow fever, along with cholera and typhoid, resulted in the Indian regiments often having 20% of their number on sick lists, and later 50% for the South Africans. Even as British forces were decimated by disease and the remorseless climate, there was some good news for the Empire. Having been cornered in the refugee delta by up to 24 Royal Navy ships, on the 11th of July 1915, the Königsberg was scuttled. Fortunately for Lettow-Vorbeck, the ship's guns were recovered and Captain Loof survived his wound from shrapnel. The defeat of the Königsberg had been made possible by comprehensive intelligence gathering on the ship's condition and the delta's depth, along with superior British firepower. On the 21st of June, the British won another victory, capturing the German radio base at Bukoba with 1,500 men against about 200 askari. Then the town was pillaged and its inhabitants were horrendously mistreated. For this collapse of discipline, the 25th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers were branded with the nickname Fusiliers. Meanwhile, the Lion of Africa continued to demonstrate his strategic cunning, launching an offensive against Seyssy on the Rhodesian border as a preemptive strike to put off any British invasion from that direction. At Saleta Hill on the 12th of February 1916, Tighe was defeated again, which confirmed the need to put a South African in command of British forces in East Africa. Soon Lettow-Vorbeck would no longer be fighting against incompetent British generals, but an Afrikaner and former Boer commandant, Jan Christian Smuts. By the end of 1915, a South African army was preparing to replace the Indian Expeditionary Forces, a staggering 75% of whom were now dead or sick. The Indians' experience of East Africa had been nothing short of hellish. Smuts planned to use Zulu tactics to envelop and destroy Lettow-Vorbeck's small army, attacking with a main central body of troops to fix the German forces in place, while the Horns outflanked them.
The classical attack of the Zulus is in the shape of a fighting bull buffalo like this. The head, the horns, and the loins. First the head moves forward, and the enemy naturally moves in to meet it. But it's only a feint. The warriors in the head then disperse to form the encircling horns, and the enemy is drawn in on the loins. And the horns close in on the back and sides. Finish.
However, in spite of the Allied forces' overwhelming numerical superiority, with over 40,000 men in the British and Belgian armies, achieving such a plan was not going to be easy. The German forces had a vast territory to move around in, which made pinning them down very difficult for their enemies. Before launching the offensive, British forces captured Saleta Hill after shelling the position, unaware of the Germans having already abandoned it. Riata and Latema Hills on the road to Taveta were also captured. Although it was the start of the rainy season, Smuts rashly went ahead with the offensive. He sent fellow Afrikaner Van de Venter on a flanking mission along the Northern Railway to attack Kondoa-Irangi. Riding off on the 8th of April 1916 and arriving at their destination on the 20th, the 1st South African Mounted Brigade lost 75% of its horses to disease from tsetse fly bites. When the 3rd South African Infantry Brigade and artillery arrived 10 days later, having been delayed by heavy rain and mud, only 3,000 men of the original 10,000 were left in fighting condition. Recently supplied by a blockade runner, Lettow-Vorbeck closed in with 4,000 askari to destroy Van de Venter's remaining troops. German artillery drove the South Africans back, but the askari failed to occupy their forward positions in a chaotic engagement on the night of the 9th to the 10th of May. The shelling of Van de Venter's beleaguered soldiers continued as they started to run low on supplies. Meanwhile, the askari kept well fed by pillaging crops and cattle from the surrounding countryside. The rest of 1916 would see German forces on the retreat, and the Lion of Africa would gain a less flattering nickname, von Lettow-Vorbeck. Belgian forces now sprang into action, securing Rwanda and Burundi from German forces. However, the British were suspicious of Belgian intentions, thinking they just wanted territorial expansion, and this caused tensions between the two allies. This did not stop an Anglo-Belgian force from compelling the Germans to abandon their base on the shores of Lake Tanganyika. Britain's other ally in East Africa, the Portuguese Expeditionary Forces, were devastated by disease and failed to make any significant contribution in the campaign. Lettow-Vorbeck's focus on Van de Venter's troops at Kondoa-Irangi meant that his forces were weakened elsewhere, enabling Smuts to lead his army along the Northern Railway. On the 18th of May, the offensive properly began, and British forces captured Mombo, giving them control of the Northern Railway. In June, the British seized Handeni, and having been unable to annihilate Van de Venter's force, Lettow-Vorbeck withdrew from Kondoa-Irangi. Dodoma on the Central Railway also fell to the unstoppable British advance, as did Tanga on the 7th of July. The Royal Navy punitively shelled the town for 9 hours, in spite of the German garrison having withdrawn, being spiteful about the defeat suffered there in 1914. Meanwhile, Brigadier General E. Northley, nicknamed Northforts, led 2,600 men into southwestern German East Africa. Lettow-Vorbeck decided to retreat his force eastwards to Morogoro by train, as Major Kraut delayed the advance of Smuts. The Germans largely destroyed the Central Railway as they withdrew. On the 4th of September, the port of Dar es Salaam was surrendered to the British. At this late stage in the campaign, the British employed a large number of native African troops, including the Gold Coast Regiment and Nigerian Brigade. Inaccurate maps, ration shortages, the wet season, and makeshift German landmines made life very unpleasant for these troops in early 1917. At this time, Smuts retired from the campaign after being chosen as the South African representative for the Imperial War Conference in London. He declared victory, hoping to leave East Africa with his reputation intact. In reality, Lettow-Vorbeck and his Schutztruppe remained very much in operation. This meant Van de Venter, who ultimately took command, had to recall South African troops sent home after Smut's unhelpful and untrue declaration. A British offensive in July was stalled, but it resumed in October. 2 British columns under Brigadier General P.S. Beeves advanced along the Lukuledi River and pushed back 9 German companies. These were led by Major General Kurt Wall, who served under the Line of Africa, despite outranking him. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Mann led the Nigerian brigade to block Wall's line of retreat at Mahiwa, prompting Lettow-Vorbeck to march over 5 companies to defend it. On the 15th of October 1917, an outflanking manoeuvre failed, and the Nigerians created a defensive perimeter. When dawn broke on the 16th of October, they found themselves surrounded by German forces. In spite of being pounded by artillery fire, the entrenched Nigerians managed to hold off the attacking troops. Beeves' force attempted to relieve them, and 1 column broke through on the 18th, but at a terrible cost for the 25th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers. Only 50 survived the German machine gun fire out of their already depleted number of 126. The Fusiliers certainly received their punishment for the sack of Bukoba. On the next day, Lettow-Vorbeck withdrew his forces. British forces suffered 1,500 casualties out of 4,500, and the German forces suffered 500 casualties out of 1,500, 1 in 3 soldiers on both sides. So it would be dubious to claim Beeves or Lettow-Vorbeck gained victory at the Battle of Mahiwa. Subsequently, Lettow-Vorbeck reduced the Schutztruppe to 14 companies, excluding all of the ill and disabled, and crossed the Rovuma River into Portuguese East Africa in November 1917. By now he commanded merely 278 Europeans and 1,700 askari. Another German force of 1,300 men surrendered to the British, having failed to link up with Lettow-Vorbeck. In spite of victories against the hopeless Portuguese forces and capturing supplies, burning all they could not carry with them to prevent it falling into enemy hands, Lettow-Vorbeck's force was now disintegrating. Morale was low, and hundreds were lost in battle or had to be left behind when they became ill. Still, the Lion of Africa invaded British northern Rhodesia, but this would be his final move. Unsurprisingly, a lot of the porters deserted at this point. On the 12th of November 1918, a British messenger informed him of the armistice. Finally, technically undefeated, but with his force at breaking point, Lettow-Vorbeck surrendered on the 25th of November. Only 155 Germans, 1,156 askari, and 1,598 porters remained to the very end. On the 17th of January 1919, after exactly 5 years in East Africa, Lettow-Vorbeck left this land where he had forged his legacy. The colony which his Schutztruppe had defended with such determination and tenacity was carved up between the British, Belgian, and Portuguese empires. To gain most of German East Africa, which was renamed British Tanganyika, later independent Tanzania, the British had lost 11,189 men, in comparison with 2,000 German askari. Belgian and Portuguese forces added about 8,000 more Allied losses. However, native non-combatants suffered the highest death toll and gained nothing for it. An estimated 90,000 porters and 300,000 civilians died, mostly from starvation. Lettow-Vorbeck's policy of pillaging for supplies and scorched earth was responsible for much of the devastation. A soldier in the Schutztruppe wrote, "Behind us we leave destroyed fields and famine for the time to come. We are no longer ambassadors of culture, we are bringing death, pillaging, and empty villages." On the other hand, British forces abstained from living off the land by using supply chains, which were cumbersome but at least humane. The famine-weakened population of sub-Saharan Africa was then hit by the Spanish flu, killing an estimated 2 million. This dark side of the East Africa campaign was hidden by the emergence of myths, such as that of the faithful askari. While many askari were loyal to Germany, there was still an 18% desertion rate. Beneath the veneer of a gentlemanly war, German officers turned a blind eye to the heinous atrocities committed by their often ill-disciplined native troops. German propaganda, which romanticized their empire and presented it as more civilized than others, missed out this disturbing reality. The East Africa campaign also fueled the far-right stab-in-the-back myth. Lettow-Vorbeck and members of the Schutztruppe were welcomed home as heroes by Germans who could not accept the country's military defeat. Instead, they blamed cowardly politicians, along with Jews and socialists, for the betrayal of the German army. Lettow-Vorbeck surrendered after the Armistice, even though he remained im Feld unbesiegt, undefeated in the field, fueled the myth. East Africa was perhaps the only theatre of World War I where this was actually true. On the Western Front, there is no doubt that German troops were militarily defeated. It is also unlikely that Lettow-Vorbeck could have fought on for much longer, with only a skeleton force and without resupply from Germany. Besides, further resistance was pointless, as Lettow-Vorbeck's aim was to draw away Allied resources and manpower from the Western Front. Ultimately, the Lion of Africa and his Schutztruppe did not make enough of a difference to achieve a German victory. However, there can be no denying that Lettow-Vorbeck was a master of fighting against the odds, and his little but highly skilled army punched well above its own weight throughout the campaign. Lettow-Vorbeck received many decorations for his service to Germany in the East Africa campaign, including the Iron Cross First and Second Class and the Prussian Pour le Mérite. During the post-war years, Lettow-Vorbeck helped crush communist uprisings in Germany. However, as a conservative nationalist, he was no supporter of the Weimar Republic, and partook in the Kapp Putsch in November 1922. This was an attempt by disbanded Freikorps to take control of Berlin and restore the Kaiser. When Hitler came to power, Lettow-Vorbeck never joined the Nazi Party and refused to become an ambassador to Britain. During World War II, he was impoverished by Allied bombing. However, West Germany's economic recovery meant that he was restored to a comfortable life. On returning to East Africa in 1953, he was greeted by askari veterans who sang Heya Safari, also the title of a book he would publish on the campaign, and received full military honours from the British authorities there. Clearly, even Lettow-Vorbeck's old enemies greatly respected him. The Lion of Africa died aged 93 on the 9th of March 1964 in Hamburg. His funeral was attended by 2 askari veterans who were flown in as state guests. Lettow-Vorbeck was an imperialist, but unusually he was not a racist. He spoke fluent Swahili, appointed black NCOs, and was reported as saying, "We are all Africans here." Such acts of racial solidarity were almost unheard of, and won the admiration of his askari. After Lettow-Vorbeck's death, the West German government decided to give askari veterans in East Africa their back pay. Some of the 350 askari veterans who gathered at Lake Victoria to receive it still had paperwork or their old uniforms as proof of their service. The rest of them were made to perform the German manual of arms with a broomstick, which none of them failed to do.